In this video, I'm going to talk about how to write a best-selling book. And it's a little bit tricky because most people consider the best-selling part of it, they think that's book marketing. So they write the book first, and then they think, now I'm going to make it a bestseller, and I'm going to spend money on advertising or marketing and get my book in front of readers, and it's going to be successful. That's rarely the way that it works. When you consider what a bestseller is, it's usually a piece of content, either nonfiction or fiction, that satisfies readers who are looking for a certain experience. So delivering that experience needs to be a core part of your writing process. If you're not writing the type of book that's going to delight and entertain readers, you're not going to have a bestseller. It's very rare that you have a bestseller. And that's a problem because most people talk about writing as an art. And they say, because most our current ideology of art is that we need to go into our cave and listen to our muse and produce art that's uninfluenced by the populace, by the plebs, the low-level people, and art is this kind of high-level thing. That's fine if you're writing literary fiction. Most literary fiction fails and won't make any money. It's very hard to get literary fiction published. You can still do that if your goal is to finish a book and that's it. And it's the book that you want to write. That's fine. If you want to write a best-selling book that people like and enjoy and review positively and make some money, that's a different thing. And you need to be considering your project as a product. So you're developing a product for sale. You need to think about who your end users are, how they're going to respond to your product. You probably should put out some kind of a minimal viable product, which is a very short sample of your writing to see if people like it. If you're not doing any of that stuff, if you're spending 2 or 3 years writing a book in a cave and then hoping it's going to be a bestseller later, that rarely works out. And that's what most authors are doing. And there are a few cases people get really excited about how some self-publishing author or even traditionally published author spent 5 years writing a book and it was a huge success and they made millions of dollars. That's possible, but it's kind of like winning the lottery. For the majority of authors who are writing books that way without considering the market, that's a recipe for failure. And I know this because I work with most, well, not most, but a very wide portion of the people who are interested in publishing a book come to me and ask me questions, or they hire me for things like book design or book marketing. So I kind of know what most people are doing, and I know how difficult it is to publish a bestseller, a best-selling book. I know how to market and design a book. I can help a lot to take your manuscript and turn it into a book that's going to be a bestseller. And a lot of that's even in the editing phase when you hire an editor, but we'll talk more about that later. But it's much harder or nearly impossible if you've written a book that has no market, that nobody wants to read. And that's what most authors are doing. You might get lucky and you're accidentally writing a book that people want to read, but you don't know that if you're not thinking about it until after you've finished the book. And that's where most authors are getting in trouble. And I'm not saying that's wrong. If that's the way that you believe literature and art has to be, that's your choice. But if you want to consider writing as a career and make money with your writing, you need to consider your reader, because your reader is your customer. They're what's going to support your writing career. They're going to pay for the thing that you're spending all your time on. If people aren't going to pay for the thing you're spending your time on, you have a hobby, and it's probably an expensive hobby because you're going to spend a lot of money publishing a book that doesn't earn any money. And you may believe that that's still a good thing to do, but I would caution you to reconsider your ideology of art and writing, and especially because it's not about selling out. If you're developing a product for sale to please your readers, it's not about selling out. It's about respecting your readers enough to give them something that entertains them. Otherwise, you're asking people to read your book when it's not an enjoyable experience, when it's not what they're looking for, when they get no satisfaction or anything out of it. It's a burden for other people to read your book, and you don't want to be producing burdens for other people. That's not art. That's not what art is. So there's nothing noble about developing a product without thinking about the market in that way. So we're going to talk more about editing and all the things we can do after you've written the book. But when you're writing the book, you need to be considering what you're offering to your readers, and you should think of it just like a product. So you say, this is my thing. You boil it down to your one sentence. This is my promise. This is the experience I'm going to deliver for fiction, or this is what you're going to learn for nonfiction, and then you have to deliver on that process, on that promise. For fiction, it's usually the promise is made with the cover design. So with fiction, if you have a dark and scary cover, you're promising the experience of a horror or thriller novel. That's the experience you need to deliver. It's assumed that part of that experience will be good storytelling and good writing. Unfortunately, that's rarely a prerequisite to publishing, because now we can self-publish. So previously, in like 10 years ago, if you wrote a bad book that was poorly written, you couldn't publish it because you needed a publisher to edit it and design it and publish it for you. Now you can self-publish, so you don't need anybody to do that for you, which means you can publish something that looks really crappy with really bad writing, but that's fine, because if you don't design it well, if you don't explain it well, readers can look inside and they'll read a few pages and they'll know that it's not a very good book and they won't buy it. But the danger is when you spend a lot of money publishing and you get a really nice cover and you get a really good editor, so it looks good, and you make the sale, but then readers don't enjoy the experience and they leave negative reviews. And that's when you pay a lot of money to publish a book that looks like a professionally done product, but doesn't really deliver. And that's almost always, part of it is writing, and you can fix the writing to some extent with editing, but a big part of it is storytelling. For both fiction and nonfiction, story matters more than the writing and more than the design or the marketing or anything else. Readers have to be able to get into the story, and it has to catch their attention enough to stay with the story through to the end. And then, whether or not they're completely satisfied, at least they feel like they've got something out of it. Like there was something good, that it was worth reading. If you're writing books that people don't consider worth reading, that's a problem, and you need to fix your writing. The easiest way to fix it, I recommend these 3 books a lot: Story Fix, Story Grid, and Plot Perfect are 3 books that kind of talk about how to make a story better, especially for fiction. For nonfiction, it's kind of a different discussion. You mostly want to create a really good outline, deliver a lot of content, a lot of useful content, and also tell a lot of interesting stories that catch people's attention. But for fiction, you need to learn how to write fiction. And it's not just about writing what they call purple prose, which is really pretty beautiful sentences. You actually don't want much of that at all, because that's kind of an amateur rookie mistake. What you want is a really clean story that's well told and structured really well. And almost always that needs to be thought out in advance. So if you consider yourself a pantser and you just want to write what you want to write and just hope it all works out, what you're going to end up with is a really messy 200,000 word collection of scenes, which is almost impossible to edit into a real novel that's going to be successful. So you need to consider learning how to plot or learning how to tell a story. You need to consider learning story architecture. Definitely those 3 books you should read, as well as like everything else on writing fiction, but especially those 3, because Story Fix and Story Grid are both written kind of by editors who help take authors' stories and turn it into an actual marketable book. So the authors usually have the idea, and usually it's pretty messy, and they kind of went through a first rough draft, and there's some good stuff there, but there's a lot of bad stuff. So Story Fix and Story Grid are kind of about how to boil down the essence of the story and get rid of all the garbage and clean it up so it's a really tight, marketable story. Plot Perfect is also similar, but it's more about, structuring your novel. So you need to, if you're writing fiction, you need to consider story architecture. It's going to save you so much time and frustration if you start out with a plan, even if it's a loose plan, so you know what happens. Here's my character, here's the first plot point, here's the midpoint, second plot point, conclusion. Even if it's very basic, you need to have your major scenes plotted out and know what happens and where they come. Because if you have a book that doesn't hit those major scenes, it's just not going to feel right to readers. They read a lot of books. Storytelling has been around for thousands of years. If your book doesn't hit these key scenes, it's just going to feel weird and off and unsatisfying to readers. And you won't know what these key scenes are if you're not studying story architecture. So definitely don't just start off with a blank page and try to figure things out as you go, because that's not really going to work. And authors come back by saying, oh, but it worked for so-and-so, and it worked for these great authors. There are best-selling authors who don't plot because they've been writing for a long time and they've written a lot of books. If this is your first book and you're still, if you haven't finished a first rough draft and gone through and edited it and gone through and published it yet, you don't really know what you're talking about. So even if it feels like this is how you feel comfortable writing, that doesn't mean you're going to produce a book that's going to be a bestseller. You need to learn your craft. You need to respect your readers enough to learn how to write better and learn how to tell a good story. And it's also just going to save you so much time and effort, and it's going to make your book so much more successful when you actually publish it. It's really not something you want to blow off and say, oh, but I'm a pantser, I don't plot, I don't need that kind of stuff. If you have that belief system, that's a limiting ideology that's really going to kill your career as an author. In the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what to do when you're stuck, a little bit more about the writing process and getting through the rough draft and getting through the final draft, because most authors I know get stuck on the book. They like thinking about everything else and preparing the book cover and the book launch and the marketing, but most authors get stuck on finishing the book, and that's a big problem that I'll address in the next video.